The treehouse hadn't sagged or surrendered. It just waited, worthless wood outside, but inside, something pricelessly disturbing held its breath. She arrived to document a rumor before bulldozers erased it, the air heavy with sap, damp, and silence. An intrusive seam ran across the floorboards. Wrong grain, wrong nails, a hidden intention. If authentic, this would rewrite a local legacy. If false, her credibility and the site would go with it. Gloved hands traced the seam. A concealed latch yielded beneath her thumb. The panel lifted. A narrow crawl opened, breathing colder air from below. No one could have predicted the emotional truth hidden inside. The decommissioned campgrounds felt like an afterthought at the edge of the county map. Cabins sagged into scrub. The dock had rotted away to ribs. The treehouse, improbably intact, rose above the understory as if the pines had agreed to hold their breath around it. Quiet birds worked the margins. The wind moved sap and old rope. The silence felt curated. She was here on a factual survey before demolition, an inventory to satisfy insurance, preservation, and a donor's conscience. The protocol lived in her pocket. Every step, photograph, record, bag, tag. Chain of custody meant the story couldn't be rewritten later by louder voices. She worked with controlled dread and steady breath, the cadence of someone who understands that history is made of fingerprints and stubborn fibers, not declarations. The ladder creaked under her weight, rungs worn to an oily smoothness by small hands that hadn't been here for decades. The platform flexed once, then settled. Inside, the light broke on sun-faded paint. The pigment leached to a dull memory of blue. The air was heavy with dust and the faint sweetness of long, decayed hay. Underfoot, a hollow echo answered her steps, wood over a promise. Initial inventory, toys bleached pale to the color of bone, a tin rusted into a reddish bloom, a child's rope ladder neatly coiled, its knots still impatient, a jar of marbles, hazy with age, a paper kite ribcage with no skin, no recent human signs, no food wrappers, no modern footprints in the dust. Yet the room had the posture of something arranged and then abandoned mid-sentence. On the west wall, graffiti dates in pencil and knife tip contradicted park records. The oldest mark carried a summer 2 years before the camp officially opened. Another, tucked near a beam, included a symbol used in staff memos she'd seen on microfilm, but never in public signage. The dates felt older than the sanctioned timeline. The building's age was wrong by intention or by neglect. Either way, the foundation of the story shifted. She mapped joinery. Against one joist, a splice that did not belong, fresh-grained wood embedded under a skin of old varnish. Her probe found modern screws sunk deep, their heads disguised with filler and amber shellac. Someone had amended the floor long after the first hammer fell. That could be repair. Or it could be a door with manners. Consequences bracketed her. If she misdated, the site would be cleared without question. If she delayed for lab verification, funding would vanish, and the bulldozer would arrive early under a different pretext. She cataloged what she could control: photo, angle, measurement. Her breath fogged in the beam of light. The silence thickened as she descended into concentration. Action pivot. She slid a thin steel probe along the seam. A dull ring, wood on beam, then a soft cavernous thud. Void. She tested the other edges. Same answer. The square was truer than a patch. It was a promise. The hatch resisted. The fibers had swelled. An iron pin inside had corroded to the thickness of a fingernail. She felt the minutes. Her escort would return after lunch with a cheerful ignorance and a mandate to move on. She pressed, then eased, pressed again. The wood complained like an old shoulder. A line of varnish gave way in a crisp pop, then closed again as if the house exhaled. She shifted to the opposite side, gloved thumb seeking imperfection. Her skin found a slight depression masked by varnish dust. There, a concealed latch, smooth from use long ago. She pressed. A quiet lever clicked. The panel lifted with the careful shudder of something that had been waiting to move. The house had 2 floors all along, one unseen. Cold air breathed up from the dark. A metallic hint of sap and damp wood held at a different pressure than the world above. The smell was not decay. It was preservation, not rot, a decision. Her light sketched a narrow crawl, boards tightened tongue and groove, edges tar-sealed where they met the trunk. She paused and looked around the visible room again, letting its personality imprint itself before the story turned. The coiled rope ladder wasn't abandoned. It had been put away. The marbles rested in a circle like planets at aphelion. The tin's lid faced east. Arrangements matter, she reminded herself. Patterns confess before people do. She recorded her note. Anomaly confirmed. Floor seam inconsistent with original construction. Evidence of concealed space beneath primary platform. Ambient temperature differential measurable. Potential for context-sensitive finds. Proceed with caution. Her voice remained even, a metronome against the churn under her ribs. A small draft lifted the ends of a paper banner pinned along the joist, each triangle bleached nearly white. Letters ghosted into illegibility. Celebration without occasion. She felt the weight of the purchase pressed on her far heavier than any price tag could. Not money, time, lives inside time. She peeled her gloves, switched to thinner nitrile for sensitivity, then re-gloved. The beam of her flashlight slid into the gap and found nothing but disciplined darkness. The moment he left, everything went wrong, she thought, and wondered where that thought had come from. Perhaps from the silence itself, asking to be translated. Her escort's truck door slammed in the distance, echoing through the scrub. She had minutes. Enough to decide whether she was opening a room or a future argument. She wanted verified access, a formal witness, a measured dissent under the umbrella of paperwork. She was blocked by time, by the weather rolling in from the ridge, by oversight that would call this curiosity and not evidence preservation. Yet beneath her determination, unease coiled. She chose to enter first to preserve context. Camera on, notes rolling, every step named, every surface captured before contamination. She slid her pack near the hatch, tethered her light, and leaned into the opening until her ribs met the edge. The air below was cooler, cleaner in a way that spoke of seals and intent. She took one final look at daylight framed by sap-sticky boards, the canopy shifting like a slow sea. Then she lowered herself into shadow, boots seeking the first rung, hands finding edges worn by someone else's certainty. The panel rested against her hip. Above, the birds resumed. Below, the silence gathered. The truth was worse, or it was waiting. The air below was still and metallic with sap, touched by the faintest mineral chill, as if the tree had drawn the weather into its veins and held it there. The silence thickened as she descended, not empty, but compressed, like the hush inside an unopened jar. Her light caught the curve of a narrow landing. Boards met at precise angles. The trunk's inner bark had been shaved and sealed, its living edge dark and smooth, an umber wall that swallowed reflection. A second door faced her, tongue and groove cedar fitted so tightly the seams drew hairline shadows. Tar glistened, knifed into every joint. A small wheel valve, brass gone dull, protruded beneath a gasket that kissed cedar to iron. She felt along the kerf. No dust, no drift of spider silk. A place designed to inhale once and never exhale. She lifted the wheel a quarter turn. The seal sighed as pressure equalized, a breath that did not belong to weather. The door moved inward with reluctant grace. Her light fell into a perfectly sealed inner chamber, and the room received it as if light had been rationed. Against one wall rested the rusting skeleton of a cot, canvas stretched and unbroken, tucked like a hospital bed. A desk stood opposite, hand-built and squared true, its corners rounded by deliberate sandpaper, not wear. A cabinet occupied the far corner, its face almost flush, the wood planed to a satin dullness. No dust drifted in the beam, no insect frass. It felt as if breath had been held for decades and would only be released if she mishandled the next minute. She kept the camera steady. Order of discovery, not curiosity. She narrated, inner chamber intact, climate apparent, cedar and tar construction, no immediate fungal bloom, controlled microenvironment possible. The brittle paper scent rose as her steps moved molecules that had waited like a choir silent between movements. A faint iron smell threaded through it, not blood, but the patient oxidation of small things. Beneath, a sweetness of long decayed hay peeped through, packing straw used once and then stilled. The layers formed an aroma like a palimpsest: wood, iron, time. On the desk lay a shallow box. Inside, photographs whose edges had turned ivory. Faces were scratched with a precise blade, not angry, but tidy, a ritual erasure. Dates were inked in a hand that kept its height even when the paper fought back. In one, children lined a path beneath this very canopy, a whistle cord catching a spot of sun at a throat. The cord had been left unmarked. The faces around it were scored until eyes became silver wounds. Beside the box, hand-drawn maps occupied a portfolio made from craft paper folded and stitched with twine. Paths ran from cabin to glade to creek, then stopped short of roads, as if someone had drawn breath and held it. Colored pencil indicated seasons. Arrows looped back. Notations marked wind direction like a sailor forced onto land. Routes that never reached town told their own refusal. On the shelf above, audio reels sat in a row, each labeled with moon phases and initials. New moon. First quarter. Full. Names reduced to single letters, sometimes doubled, sometimes paired with a symbol like a chevron or a hollow square. A small portable player, older than her, waited with its lid folded up, wires coiled like sleeping snakes. The machine had been wiped down long ago and then left, as if the owner believed dust was a form of confession. A ledger waited on the desk's right side, its cloth spines squared, its corners capped with tin. A pencil lay across it, sharp but dulled at the tip by a single interrupted line. The ledger was heavier than it looked. Her gloved hands felt the compression of tight paper. Columns of marks ran like tides, 5 hash marks grouped, then a line, then a blank, then a symbol. Dates aligned to the lunar cycles. Every 4th line included a note in code. Letters that weren't initials, numbers that weren't ages. She did not open it yet. The urge to postpone meaning rose like heat. A brass key hung from a twine bracelet, the loop small enough to sit snug on a child's wrist. The brass had been polished by fingers that chose to keep it ready. The knot bore the memory of a hand that could tie without looking. She did not touch it. She let the camera see it from angles, then spoke its fact and not its implication. Only then did she realize the room was a controlled environment. The gasket on the door, the vent bored discreetly into the trunk and capped with a fine mesh. The cedar had been oiled, then sealed, then oiled again. Even the cabinet joints had been waxed, so they sang no friction. Pristine preservation suggested intent. Someone meant this to be found intact or never found at all. Preservation can be a gift or a threat with manners. She threaded the first reel to the portable player with careful hands, resisting the edge of her curiosity that wanted the ledger first. Order matters. The reels were labeled with moons and initials. She chose the earliest full moon, marked with a simple O. The tape was supple. The leader passed the guides without complaint. She closed the lid, powered the machine with her external pack converted for low draw, and held her breath as the capstan turned. The reel hummed. For a moment, the room filled with a heartbeat-like noise, not from her chest, but from the machine's age and the tape's stored friction. Then a voice, measured, detached, scribed the air. Field watch, immediate perimeter, 1812, 2 at the southwest path. Criteria unmet, redirect successful. No names offered, only initials, only distances, 50 paces, then retreat to the bend. The cadence held like a metronome, steady even when a gust brushed the microphone with Leaves' dry hands. Entry after entry recited sightings, times, and protocol. When moon thin, watch edges. When moon full, stay to height. The word retain appeared like a rock in a stream, redirect's colder cousin. Criteria met when alone, when path missed, when time wrong. It sounded like care if you didn't know the words. It sounded like selection if you listened twice. She steadied her breath and noted that the voice avoided surnames, avoided anything that could endure weather. The ritual guarded itself. Initials could be anyone until someone decided they weren't. She rewound to a line where wind blurred syllables. Beneath it sat a whisper that could have been thought out loud. Not this one. Her skin tightened under her sleeves. She turned to the ledger. The cipher mirrored the reel's cadence. Hash groups aligned with moon phase labels. Where the tape said redirect, the ledger showed a diagonal slash. Where the tape paused, the hash line broke. Where the voice said retain, the ledger squared a small box around the initials, then recorded a distance instead of an address, as if a map inside a mouth. The marks were tidy. Careful people can be frightening. Her light found the cabinet again. The key's weight in the air seemed to grow. The turn she had been postponing approached, not just narratively, but physically. She reached and felt her hand shake, not from doubt about procedure, but from the knowledge that procedure was the only barrier between her and meaning. She spoke the moment aloud, key likely fits cabinet, time stamp running, and let language slow her pulse. She crossed the room, the cedar underfoot barely creaking, the tree accepting the trespass because secrets prefer witnesses who behave. The brass key was smooth where fingers had taught it obedience. The twine was tight, its fibers burnished. She paused, camera steady on the lock, then lifted the key and pressed it into the ward. The fit was precise, the click unyielding. The cabinet's hinges sighed, the room's breath seemed to wait. And beneath the top stack, some final envelope bore block letters that stood like a wall. Confession. What she wanted was truth and proof in the same breath. What blocked her was the fear of tainting evidence with the heat of her own urgency. and the more intrusive fear that understanding would not let her sleep again. Procedure steadied her, but dread threaded through it like wire in plaster. She turned the key. The click was unyielding, final. Hinges sighed in a practiced arc. Inside, sealed envelopes lay in disciplined rows, wax intact, each stamped with a small imprint of the same hollow square from the reels. A metal badge nested beside them on black felt, its enamel chipped but legible. A youth welfare seal from a department that no longer answered phones. At the bottom, one envelope bore a title in block letters that did not ask permission: Confession. She recorded the seal's condition, the angle, the light, then slid the blade under the flap. It was not discovery. It was inheritance. And the room waited for the first sentence. The confession's voice began with a preface masked as a prayer. Not to absolve, to document. He called himself the caretaker and then corrected it. Watchman sounded less righteous. Necessary watches, he said, from the tree's height because the ground forgot what it couldn't see. His tone was precise, unrelenting, each clause joined to the next, as if the world would come apart without his syntax. The contents were a ledger of surveillance disguised as duty. Children walking paths alone while counselors washed dishes and whistles lay on hooks. Directives appeared in a tidy hand. Redirect to staffed zones when criteria unmet. Retain when criteria met. Criteria floated at the edge of definition. Alone. Time off route. Hesitation near the bend. In the confession, the words softened nothing. Redirect meant step from shadow and guide with a badge. Retain meant something else, and he wrote it in a way that made grammar feel complicit. She marked an analogy in her notes because metaphors sometimes keep the mind from breaking. The secret was a labyrinth. The path in was always shorter than the path out. He had built a language that folded back on itself like cedar boards, tongue and groove, no gap where oxygen could enter and ignite belief. Evidence cross-check was where her steadiness returned. The altered photographs matched the initials spoken on the tapes. O by the creek, J at the rope swing, a pair of twins marked as SS, their faces scored at different angles as if to keep them separate. The hand-drawn maps aligned with seasonal migrations toward the glade, colored pencil crescents indicating light levels through leaves. The term glade repeated in the confession with an intimacy that suggested ownership. He wrote it as if inside a deed. A human trace rose up from the paper like a hand from a shallow pool. The twine bracelet on the desk explained a missing persons poster she remembered from a digitized newspaper sidebar. It had been an afterthought in the layout, a filler for a column's gap. The bracelet in the photo had looked like an ordinary summer craft. The bracelet here was tied for endurance, not decoration. She felt the smallness of the loop through her gloves and put it down as if it could still be warm. Complication arrived in the badge. The enamel was cracked, but the seal was unmistakable. A defunct youth welfare department whose records had been absorbed and then softened by privacy and time. It offered plausible access to children and paths and protocol. In his confession, he referenced procedure numbers that sounded official without anchoring to any statute she could name. He understood that language is a key that opens locked rooms and locked people. The stakes deepened as the ledger's last pages moved from the treehouse outward. Deliveries listed to an unnamed receiving house with distances measured by paces, not addresses. 15, then a turn. 30 along fence, 12 to door. No town names, only vectors, as if naming a place could ruin the spell or conjure a witness. The marks were careful enough to be a map without a map. She realized too late the truth was worse than one man's broken duty. It was an organized channel masked as protection, the treehouse a node rather than a nest. The confession did not weep. It arranged. He described visits from supervisors who never left signatures, described audits that counted blankets and missed eyes. He wrote, "When the light in the tower failed, the policy was to move intake off-site." He wrote, "I followed the order until I saw what the order did." Her hands worked without tremor while her chest tightened. She documented every page edge, every puncture mark from staples, every ink blot that suggested frustration he had not permitted himself to voice. She sealed each envelope in evidence sleeves, the plastic rasping in the sealed room like a harsh breath. Fingerprints through gloves can still exist. She kept her touch to corners and margins. Her voice remained measured, notes clocked on the minute. Then the turn. A final ledger line was unfinished. The pen stroke trailed off like a vine cut mid-climb. The date aligned with a known storm she had tracked in weather archives when researching the camp's empty years. A pressure drop that cracked limbs and rolled aluminum canoes like leaves. The confession broke there, without period, as if the room itself had closed his mouth. She looked up from the paper at the cedar walls that had listened to him for years. A knot in the board's grain resembled an eye with its lid half lowered. She exhaled and thought of the but, therefore pattern that kept people honest. He believed he was necessary, but necessity became a veil. Therefore, he wrote a confession to a future reader he both feared and summoned. It was not just discovery, it was inheritance, and it was not clean. The human map widened. In the confession, he listed nights he stayed, awake to watch the glade, and nights he let the lantern die early. When criteria met, retain to the path, he wrote, the phrase a compromise between verb and sin. Twice he wrote an aside in smaller letters. Not this one. Once he added, too young, then crossed it out so lightly the pencil still breathed the words. Her mind pulled the lines outward across paper and then across soil. The altered photos showed faces scratched, but bodies posed obediently along rails and ropes and creek stones. The maps showed paths that never reached roads. The ledger showed distances to a door no one named. The badge showed the system's face, enamel over steel. The confession showed the interior, how people make policy into shelter and cage at the same time. She wrote one more analogy because analogies can hold grief while facts march. This secret was a human map drawn with erasures. Every route had two exits, one marked with a square, one marked with a circle. The squares were retained, the circles were redirected. The lines between them were sentences a community would not say. The unfinished line, the storm date, the silence on the reels after that day, they formed a shape her training recognized. Closure by weather is a common myth in archives. Fires and floods are blamed for what hands prefer to smudge. Yet here, the storm was real, and the pen stopped in honest air. He had been writing himself out of the machine when the machine's roof lifted. She set the confession aside and returned to the player. The reel labeled with that storm's moon was short. Wind walked the microphone. His voice recited until it didn't. A cough, a soft metallic pop as if a flame had kissed a valve. Then nothing. She heard beneath the sound a smaller sound, maybe a footstep, maybe a child's breath in a corner. She would need noise reduction later to know if hope leaked into that moment or only the room's physics. She closed the ledger gently and felt the weight of the purchase press on her far heavier than any price tag could. Not money, not even time. The burden was his, and now it was hers, transferred by paper and iron and cedar, and the stubborn fact of a voice that had recorded its own diminishment. The air did not move, the tree listened, and the human map waited for someone to look without flinching. Duty demanded external corroboration before the story hardened. Time and weather threatened to wash the edges smooth. She climbed to the hatch, radio clipped, breath measured, and called in quiet code. Request microfilm pulls for camp summers bracketing the storm. Property ledgers for off-site youth facilities. Index of missing children within a 50-mile radius. She listed initials, dates, moon phases, distances without places. Static answered, then a voice she trusted. Copy. She added a badge description and the hollow square mark. Her contact promised reels on standby, case numbers incoming, and a scan of old budget minutes if they still existed. Minutes later, a tight return pinged her handset. Badge number located on a shuttered receiving home deed archived under a charitable alias. Duplicate seal. Quiet closure. She wrote the number on her glove with a grease pencil and felt the treehouse tilt closer, as if the wider world had finally leaned its weight against the door. The room existed, but its creator had masked intent behind policy language. The badge matched, therefore the role was institutional, not solitary. The home had closed quietly, therefore records were sealed under privacy statutes thick as tar. She built the chain aloud in the sealed air so the logic could be heard later without her in it. Evidence began to arrive by voice first, then by text. Image bled through a weak connection. Microfilm notes came as transcribed lines, brief notices in a small-town weekly post-storm, placements diverted due to facility damage, temporary care under emergency statute, euphemism held like stitching. Budget minutes surfaced next, a line item for an unofficial off-site intake near the woods, charged to contingency, approved without debate. She felt the bureaucratic hand shaping a corridor where feet could be moved without names. A faded photo attached to a local circular arrived last. A counselor smiled beside a hand-painted sign, Nature Classroom Pilot. Behind her, the treehouse's silhouette was unmistakable, softened by distance, framed by green. A caption praised innovative approaches to resilience. She pressed thumb and forefinger to her brow. It was not just a hideout. It had been presented to the community as a balm. Complication flickered through the data like a fish in shallow water. One ledger initial appeared years later in an unrelated census entry. Different county, an adult name she could triangulate only by birth month and a rare middle initial embedded in a voter roll. Survival had threaded the maze. She sat with that knowledge for a breath, letting relief exist beside anger. The human map was not only loss, it contained return. She tracked the survivor's adult address on public registries, stopped before the temptation to knock could even form. No direct contact. The ethics were not a costume she wore for grant committees. They were the spine of the work. She searched for patterns instead, employment and care systems, petitions signed, boundary lines drawn. The thread stayed faint, but it held. Empathy over intrusion became the pivot. The story could devour lives a second time if she fed it wrong. She set her own name aside and built an evidence map that did not require a protagonist. Pins for dates, lines for distances measured in paces, squares for retains, circles for redirects. The pattern closed like a noose around the glade, and touched again and again the corridor between the treehouse and the shuttered receiving home. Turn in the pattern arrived as a mismatch she had not expected. One child listed as retained reappeared months later in a hospital intake log under a different county's emergency department, listed as found. No badge, no escort. Internal dissent suggested itself like a hidden door, a last-minute rescue, or a quiet refusal by someone within the machine. The ledgers aside, not this one, echoed with new weight. She revisited the audio, spooling back through wind and measured cadence. With noise reduction, a whisper beneath the canopy resolved into intent. Not this one, she heard again, and then another line nearly lost to static. Lantern off, pass through, sabotage within compliance. A knife on the wall finally used not to cut, but to sever a rope binding one path to another. Corroboration demanded walls as much as paper. She noted the receiving home's deed trail. A charitable trust with a comforting name purchased the property after the storm, then dissolved it 2 years later, transferring assets to a regional foundation. The badge number appeared on an inventory list archived in a county surplus file, issued, returned, unaccounted for. Silent walls answer only with their paint. She kept asking. She extracted county meeting minutes where a supervisor praised a program that reduced vagrancy among youth near the park after storms. Reduced vagrancy was a phrase that opened and closed like a mouth around anything you didn't wish to see. The months aligned with the ledger's busiest pages. The moon phases were not poetry. They were a schedule that exploited light and shadow the way a sailor reads tide tables. Her contact sent a scan of a back-page column in a church bulletin, thanking volunteers for moving supplies to a hillside safe space during infrastructure repairs. The date sat between two ledger retains. In the margin, a note in a hand she recognized from the confession listed quantities that matched blanket counts. The logistics had been dressed in charity's clothes. Across town, unaware of the danger of old paper, a clerk texted a grainy image from a bound assessor's volume. A penciled annotation beside the receiving home's parcel. Foundation crack, lower level sealed, entry barred. Sealed spaces resembled this room in miniature. She drew the parallel without forcing it, letting the pattern remain an outline others could color later. She laid artifact against artifact. The nature classroom photograph functioned as a permission slip hung on a wall. The budget minutes paid for the key. The microfilm notices smoothed public silence. The church column harvested hands. The badge unlocked faces. The ledger wrote distances to a door whose frame had no address. The reel recorded obedience and moments of refusal. Each piece alone could be a misunderstanding. Together, they formed an instruction. She stepped back from her evidence map and traced the line of the one reappearing child. Retained, then found. The hospital intake listed exposure and dehydration, no guardian present. Intake social worker noted the child declined to name. A camp, only woods. A signature at the bottom belonged to a trainee who did not stay long. She wrote a letter to that name and did not send it. The but therefore pattern held her spine straight. He watched, but the system watched him. Therefore, the confession exists. The institution masked itself with care, but the paper bled at the edges. Therefore, the truth can be taught without tearing living people open in public. It would require a path that refused spectacle. She stared at the cedar joinery and felt the weight of history sit heavy in her hands, even in thought. The tree had been made into a sentinel and a sieve. It filtered children by criteria, but also filtered guilt until it condensed on the ledger's last page. She had enough to move outward without speculation, enough to build a corridor for investigators who did not answer to the same quiet office that had once sealed doors. She tightened the straps on her pack, labeled the series, and prepared to step back into weather. The air in the room did not change, yet something in it seemed to exhale, as if corroboration had opened a vent that preservation alone could not. Tension knotted at the hinge between evidence and motive. Was the keeper complicit, or a saboteur hiding inside a machine that rewarded obedience? She replayed the reels, lowering the noise floor until wind separated from breath. Beneath a gust, the whisper surfaced again, not this one, followed by a hush that felt chosen, not accidental. She leaned closer to the speaker. In the storm-labeled reel, after the rigid cadence, a faint ignition pop cracked the soundscape, as if a flame kissed resin somewhere just out of frame. He coughed once, the sound human and unadorned, and then the tape slid into silence that was heavier than any mechanical failure. The split intent became legible. He had enforced criteria, yet he had also tampered with the console of harm when it mattered. The room around her seemed to tilt toward that contradiction. It was not absolution. It was a fracture running through policy, person, and cedar alike. She rebuilt the storm night like a carpenter reassembling a broken chair without adding or subtracting wood. Pressure fell. Branches groaned. The silence thickened as he descended the hatch, each rung delivering him deeper into the chamber he had tuned to his own breath. He threaded a reel and spoke names to the machine like a litany, initials paired with moon, distances murmured to an audience of cedar and coil. Then he lit the small stove, a practical choice in any other weather. Resin fumes rose. Heat warped the door's softened gasket a fraction. The vent's balance shifted. Oxygen thinned. His pen line, caught mid-sentence in the ledger, lost its spine. The reel recorded the pop, the cough, then failed to carry his voice across the gap where air should have been. Forensic logic held without theatrics. The room was designed to keep time from gnawing the paper, to keep dust out and intention in. On a night when barometric pressure pressed like a palm on the canopy, a small fire could tilt the room from preservation toward trap. He had built a microclimate, and the storm made it a prison for a man who understood the climate's mechanics too well to forgive himself after. She wrote the human map again, this time with him at its center. A man inside a system, carving his cell from cedar and policy, believing that control would redeem the bargain he'd made with obedience. He watched from height to catch children drifting from sanctioned paths. He redirected with badge and tone. He retained by criteria and code. But some nights, the lantern stayed dark. Some nights he wrote, "Not this one." And the path that led to the receiving door lost its edge. Complication flickered from the desk. A second set of fingerprints, smaller, pressed on the underside near the knee space. The powder she dusted there clung in ovals that were not his. A child had once folded into that hollow, knees to chest, while he moved in the room above or below, within earshot, perhaps both jailer and shield. The weight of that print collapsed distance. The chamber was not only a snare. Sometimes it was also a refuge against something worse outside its cedar ribs. New stakes arose with that discovery. The story could not settle into a single moral. If the room saved one, it did so while serving a system that harmed many. She traced ledger hash marks against patrol rosters she'd pulled in Act 4, the ones that listed counselor rounds and night quiet checks. On certain nights when particular staff were on duty, the ledger's retains dipped and redirects rose. On those nights, the player's background hum changed timbre, the lantern off, passed through. The pattern implied sabotage within compliance. A blade hung on the wall of Act Thirds, finally used not to cut rope, but to sever a loop in the root. She let the treehouse's physics help her. The gusts that night would have pressed sap back into the trunk, tightened boards, made the hatch resist, made the vents mesh sing. He would have known that sound. He would have known the risk of flame in a reduced oxygen room. Yet the stove lit anyway. Accident was plausible. So was choice. A deliberate ignition to bring walls down on a node he could no longer bear to operate. The ignition pop on the reel read both ways, and her ethics refused to pick the easier one. She pressed her palm against the cedar now, cool despite the memory of heat. The air was still loyal to its design. She pictured the pen rolling from his fingers, graphite tracing a soft arc against the ledger's tin-capped corner. She imagined his last intact act was to push a drawer with the bracelet inside farther back, as if hiding it could protect the child it had once circled. Imagination is dangerous in rooms like this. She kept it brief, then returned to facts. Fact, small prints under the desk. Fact, a cough, then silence. Fact, the gasket would have flowed under heat, then reset when the temperature fell. A seal could become a plug. Fact, the storm date matched emergency notices that moved placements off-site, creating a surge the receiving home was not built to absorb. Into that surge, a man who once followed orders might have thrown a wrench, even if the wrench cost him air. She drew the room on her pad as a diagram of decisions. Door, vent, stove, desk, reel, each with arrows indicating agency. None of them absolved, none of them damned. He had built a system within a system, believing that if he could control every joinery, he could balance harm with care. That belief had held until the night it broke under weather and intent. Outside, a new gust flexed the canopy. The tree creaked like an old ship. She listened and heard only what was present. Her breath, her equipment, the tiny scratch of graphite as she labeled prints she would not photograph for public release. The child deserved to remain a person, not an exhibit. The evidence would travel without the humanity sanded off. She turned off the player and let the room return to its long silence. The reconstruction belonged on paper now, not in sound. She sealed the last sleeve, clicked the pen, and stood. The chamber, its cedar, its tar, its disciplined air, had revealed enough to build a path forward that did not require her to stand in judgment. It required her to choose where judgment would occur, and under whose authority. The storm night was not a puzzle to be solved with an elegant twist. It was a map of pressures, choices, and a last breath she could not carry for him. Tension gathered at her throat as the exit approached. Reveal publicly and rupture family's fragile peace. Bury it and become the next keeper who files silence under respect. She drafted 2 statements, one crisp for law, one tender for the community, and stopped with both half-formed. Across her notes, the but therefore chain insisted on a third path. The evidence deserved independent custodians who could audit without local pressure. Survivors deserved agency without cameras at their door. She chose the corridor between. She packaged the reels, the ledger scans, the badge number, the deed trails, anonymized prints. She encrypted copies and scheduled transfers to an external archive with oversight. She wrote a brief, factual narrative, names removed, distances intact, procedures cited. Then she closed the cabinet, returned the bracelet to its capsule, and set a discreet marker under the hatch for investigators who would come. It was not secrecy. It was a trail, and she would not walk it alone. She worked the ritual of departure as if it were liturgy. Artifacts first, reels, ledger, photographs, maps, badge, the sealed confession. Each entered a sleeve with a new label that named only what the object could prove. She logged chain of custody numbers and mirrored files to encrypted drives, cross-checking timestamps against the recorder's internal clock. The room deserved precision. Survivors deserved restraint. She built anonymized indexes that replaced initials with non-sequential tokens. The ledger's distances remained because distances can be verified without turning a person into proof. She added survivor-first protocols to the packet, contact guidelines that prioritized opt-in disclosure, trauma-informed process notes, the requirement that any press inquiry route through independent advocates. It was not decoration. It was the spine of how this truth would move. Emotion edged the work, but it did not steer. It was not just discovery, it was inheritance. The burden was made of paper and breath, theirs and his, and the dense silence of a room that had held its air for decades. The weight in her hands sat heavier than any price tag could, and yet the weight was what kept the story from floating into spectacle. She recorded a measured narrative to accompany the transfer. Facts, and only those anchored in physical evidence. She avoided names. She avoided words that implied motive where only actions were documented. Her voice remained level. The cadence was deliberate. She described cedar and tar, vent and gasket, reel and ledger, badge and deed trail. She described the whisper, not this one, without granting it sainthood. She included the small fingerprints without the photograph, their existence enough to shape procedure. Pattern interrupt. She paused the recorder and set her palm on the rough cedar. The grain pressed back like a quiet pulse. The air still held his last exhale, or so it felt, though she would not write that anywhere official. She let the silence wash her, then stepped back. Devotion could cloud judgment. She would honor the human map without worshiping any of its cartographers. She moved the evidence to a hard case lined with inert foam and tamper tape, then drafted the transfer agreement to a trusted external archive beyond local power's reach. Auditable, public-facing, answerable to a board with no stake in the county's pride. She scheduled a courier not through county channels, but through a university consortium that had already trained staff on handling contested histories. Oversight mattered. Distance mattered. Complication arrived in the form of a cheerful text from a local official requesting early access for situational awareness and community healing. She refused in writing, citing statute, ethics, and the risk of witness intimidation masked as pastoral care. She included the badge number and the sealed room description as reasons to maintain chain of custody integrity. The reply cooled. She logged the exchange as an artifact in its own right. Setup became payoff in her hand, the twine bracelet, child-sized fibers burnished by worry, had become a symbol. She did not send it with the case. Instead, she placed it in a sealed capsule labeled with a token code and returned it to the room beneath the desk, a gesture of respect without erasure. If a future survivor wanted it, they would request it through the advocates. No institution would hang it on a wall as proof of caring. She tightened the last seal, then lifted her pack. Before she closed the hatch, she left a discreet marker for future investigators. A thin brass tag tucked into the tongue and groove seam above the hinge, stamped with the external archive's accession number and a hotline run by people who would listen first. Not a secret, a trail. The opposite of how this had lived before. She stepped out onto the platform and let the canopy's sway fold around her. Wind passed through needles like a low choir. The treehouse no longer felt like a shrine or a crime scene. It felt like a junction finally correctly labeled on a map. She locked the hatch with the old hardware and laid a temporary seal over it, not to keep people out, but to show that someone had entered with care and left with the story intact. At the truck, she double-checked the case locks and mirrored the data again, then sent the transfer packet with its measured narrative to the external archive's secure server. Confirmation pinged back with an accession timestamp and a short message that did not praise or scold. Received. Independent review underway. Expected wait. Weeks, not months. She exhaled, a small surrender to relief. On the way out, a volunteer in a windbreaker waved and asked what she'd found. Structures older than records, she said. Cedar held better than it should. Both true, both insufficient to hurt anyone. The volunteer nodded, satisfied by the shapelessness, and returned to clearing brush from a trail that used to lead to the glade. She paused at the gate and looked back at the line of trees. The work ahead would be slow. Paper answers slow, and that pace was protection. But the corridor was built now, and it did not run through offices that had once sealed doors. It ran through brass tags and accession numbers, through protocols that put living people before narrative convenience. And yet, as she closed the tailgate, she felt the inherited burden settle in a way that did not crush. It organized itself. The human map had always existed. Now it could be read without tearing the page. She put the truck in gear and drove toward the county road, the case buckled beside her, the story already leaving her hands in the only direction that felt like care. The door settled behind her as the canopy swayed, and the weight of history sat heavy in her hands without asking for absolution. If you want more investigations that honor the human map beneath forgotten walls, subscribe and tell us where you are watching from. Follow the channel to uncover more forgotten legacies and meet us on the next trail.